Oscar Piastri had Formula One in a headlock, 34 points clear of Lando Norris, more than 100 ahead of Max Verstappen. Headlines already calling him the next world champion. And yet, a few months later, he's the guy standing on the edge of the photos while Norris lifts the trophy and McLaren talks about their champion. So what happened? How did the future of F1 end up in his teammate's shadow? Tonight, we're unpacking the collapse of Oscar Piastri's golden season. When you look back at the start of 2025, it's almost hard to believe how different Oscar Piastri's world felt. This wasn't a guy hanging on to a top seat by reputation or banking on potential. For months, he was the one everyone else was chasing. 34 points clear of Lando Norris, a huge 104-point gap to Max Verstappen. Weekend after weekend, the same pattern. Calm radio, clean laps, ruthless execution. Piastri wasn't just winning races, he was quietly building something much bigger. The feeling that the next era of Formula One might belong to him. Inside the paddock, people started talking about him differently. Commentators stopped calling him the impressive young Australian and started calling him a future world champion. Engineers from rival teams mentioned his name with a mixture of respect and unease. He had that cold, clinical aura. Not wild, not dramatic, just efficient. Where others flared up and made mistakes, Oscar kept collecting points, extending that lead, acting like he'd been fighting for titles his whole life. For a while, the story of 2025 was simple. This was Piastri's championship to lose. Lando Norris and Max Verstappen were in the role he'd grown up watching them play. The hunters, not the hunted. But the thing about Formula One is that it never lets a story stay simple. All it takes is one bad weekend to change the tone and one bad month to rewrite a season. Slowly, almost invisibly at first, the clean lines of Oscar's title charge started to blur. A small mistake here, a crash there, an off weekend when the car balance felt just a little off and the points gap shrank instead of growing. On paper, you can write it as incidents, a costly error, a result that slipped away, a strategy that didn't quite click. On the human side, it's something different. That shift from walking into the paddock feeling like everyone is behind you, to walking in and feeling something heavy on your shoulders for the first time. Expectation. Meanwhile, on the other side of the McLaren garage, Lando Norris did what great drivers do when they smell even the slightest opening. He didn't need to be spectacular every Sunday. He just needed to be relentlessly sharp. A podium on a day when Oscar faltered. A win when the car came alive. A damage limitation second when the race could have been worse. Little by little, the gap that once looked untouchable began to feel negotiable. What made it worse for Piastri was that he knew exactly what was happening. He could see Norris's side of the garage growing more confident, could feel the questions starting to change from, when will Oscar wrap this up, to, could this actually swing back toward Lando? Then came the moments that cut deeper than any lap time, the strategic calls and the team orders. Monza became a symbol of that. It wasn't just about a position swap or a single race outcome. It was about what that call said out loud. When McLaren told Oscar to move aside, when they framed it as the right thing for the team, they didn't just move a car on track. They moved something inside his head. Piastri is not the kind of driver who screams on the radio and throws his toys. He plays the long game, keeps his voice low, says the right things. But after Monza, you could feel that something fundamental had cracked. When he later reposted comments suggesting that McLaren favored Norris, people noticed. When those close to him, like Kyle Call, hinted that he didn't fully trust the team anymore, it confirmed what a lot of fans already suspected. This wasn't just a title slipping away, it was a relationship changing. From there, every setback felt bigger than the points lost. A DNF didn't just drop him down the standings, it fed the idea that the universe was bending toward Norris. A strategy that didn't work for Oscar didn't feel like a one-off. It felt like another example for the people whispering, McLaren have chosen their guy. Inside the walls of Woking, the official line never wavered. Both drivers equal, both supported, both vital. But the reality in a championship fight is that equality lives on a knife edge. Tiny advantages, tiny priorities, tiny margins can accumulate on one side. And when one of those drivers actually brings home the title, that knife edge tips. Abu Dhabi was the moment when all of that became visible in a single image. Lando Norris, emotional, lifting the World Championship trophy for McLaren's first driver's crown since 2008. Orange flags in the stands, fireworks, TV cameras chasing him from Parc Fermé to the podium to the press conference. Somewhere in that same paddock was Oscar Piastri, the man who had led this championship for longer than anyone, now standing in the background of his teammates' coronation. Third in the championship. Not a failure, not an embarrassment, but unmistakably no longer the center of the story. For a driver who had once held Formula One in his hands, that must have felt like losing something far bigger than a title. He'd lost the version of his future he'd been living in his head. The FIA Gala made the hierarchy even clearer. These events are pure optics. Trophies, tuxedos, stage photos. But optics matter in F1. Lando at the center of the stage, the official world champion, sponsors swarming him, microphones pushed in his face. Piastri again a few steps off to the side, shaking hands, smiling for pictures, but not the one the cameras follow into the lift or the car outside. In a sport built on perception and power, nights like that leave a mark, especially when you've spent the first half of the year as the man everyone thought they'd be photographing in that exact spot. And that's where we find Oscar Piastri now. Not broken, not exposed as a fraud, but stuck. His speed hasn't evaporated. Everyone in the paddock still knows how dangerous he can be over one lap or over a season. Team principals still watch his onboards and see a driver who could lead a project. But inside McLaren, the gravity has shifted to Lando Norris. The car that was once theirs increasingly feels like it will be built around what the reigning world champion wants. The strategy meetings will inevitably weigh his races more heavily. The long-term development path will be drawn, consciously or not, with the thought, how does this keep Lando in the fight for another title? For Oscar, the choices ahead are brutally narrow. He can stay and accept that, for now, he is the man in the shadows, the driver who has to beat a world champion teammate in what the world sees as his team just to get half the credit. That path is mentally exhausting but potentially glorious. Imagine the narrative flip if he does it. The guy who once lost a title from in front comes back, outdrives the champion, and forces McLaren, the media, and the fans to admit that maybe they crowned the wrong king first time around. That storyline is still there for him, and in some ways it's even more powerful now than it was when he was cruising 104 points ahead. The other path is the one everyone loves to talk about, but very few drivers can walk. Leaving, jumping ship to a different team that promises him number one status, fresh air, a new project. On paper, it sounds attractive. In reality, every door has a catch. Red Bull is built, politically and technically, around Max Verstappen. If Verstappen stays, Piastri walks into the heart of a dynasty that has spent a decade engineered around one man. If Verstappen goes and Oscar replaces him, he arrives just as the team loses its foundation and faces a new engine era with fresh uncertainties. Ferrari offers history, passion, and global attention, and a recent track record of volatility and internal storms that would make any driver who's just lived through McLaren politics think twice. Complicating all of this is 2026, the regulation reset that usually makes teams cling to stability. New engines, new aero, new systems, exactly the kind of moment where you want drivers who know your people, your processes, and your culture. That makes it harder for Piastri to force a move and harder for a big team to throw their entire structure into chaos just to sign him. So he lives in this strange in-between space. Too good to be a clear number two, too blocked to be an uncontested number one, too valuable for McLaren to let go easily, yet not central enough to feel fully in control of his destiny. In the end, Oscar Piastri's 2025 season might be remembered as one of those butterfly effect years Formula One specializes in. If he converts that early dominance into a title, everything flips. He's the world champion. McLaren builds around him. Norris becomes the one facing questions and maybe thinking about moving on. Instead, a handful of small failures, a few unlucky weekends, one or two painful calls from the pit wall, and the rise of Lando Norris turned it into something very different. The year where Oscar had F1 in his hands and somehow watched it slide away, not into disaster, but into a kind of stalled limbo. What happens next will decide whether 2025 becomes the cautionary story of a career that never quite recovered from losing its first big chance, or the hard, ugly chapter that Oscar one day points to and says, "That's where I learned what it really takes to be a world champion." Because the truth is, his story isn't finished. He's still young, still elite, still lining up on the same grid as Norris and Verstappen and the rest. But the next move has to be his. Either he finds a way to fight his way out of the shadow from inside McLaren, or he gambles on a new home in a paddock where every decision can make or break a legacy. For now, one thing is undeniable. There was a moment when Oscar Piastri looked like he owned the future of Formula One. Today, he's the reminder of how quickly this sport can take that feeling away.